Perfect. Welcome everyone from across the province. So the ASAA Town Hall here, this is our second one. If you're joining us the second time, hopefully we're going to do even better than last time. For those that are joining for the first time, welcome. Glad you're here. We want to get as informed as we can so we can support those student athletes and coaches in their work. I'm George Hoyt, the current president of the ASAA, and I'll be the moderator today. Our panelists include, off the mic for housekeeping. He's going to tell you where to go pee and all those kind of things like that, and where to put your questions. Mike?
Thanks, George. Welcome, everybody. Glad we've been able to put these webinars on. We've had some good feedback so far. I did want to, like George mentioned, touch on a very quick housekeeping item. I'll say item because it's really just the one. You'll notice this looks a little bit different than most other Zoom meetings you may have been a part of over the last couple months. This is a webinar, not a meeting, which means you don't have the ability to turn your microphone or camera on. We can't see you or hear you. So if you would like to ask a question, we do have a formal slide deck, which will take 15-20 minutes to get through, and the rest of the presentation will be going through your questions. So please, you'll note in the top or bottom ribbon, depending on what type of device you're on, you'll notice a little Q&A button. Please submit your questions through there. Submit them throughout the presentation, and then we will answer as many as we can after we get through the formal slides, and any that we do not actually address, we'll be putting a document together after the fact that we'll distribute out to our membership. So please, that is the way that we will ask you to submit your questions, and if you have any tech issues, then you are going to need to rely on your local in-school tech support, because we're not equipped to be handling that for now. That being said, I will pass it back to George, who will get us started.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. Once again, nothing will be answered in the chat. We'll either answer it in person now, or we'll get back to you with an answer on it, just so you know. We got John Payton, ASAA current executive director. We got Martin Davish from SPARS. We got Stephen Patrick from SPARS, both with a ton of wealth of experience, and they're doing about 4 of these a day. So they're kind of the experts that we rely on. And then we got past president Rick Gilson joining us from, is that Soldier Field? No, that's not Soldier Field, because that'd be the Bears. That's Candlestick. Is that right, Rick? So welcome.
Levi Stadium.
Okay, perfect. All right. With that being said, I just want a quick overview. We're going to go through the history. We're going to touch on the ASAA membership, coaches' education requirements. Very important that we still maintain those even during COVID. Competitions, talking about local, provincial, and zone level. Quick president from our SPARS partners who are also here to help answer some of those questions at the end. I'll pass it over to John, who's just going to go through the first few slides.
Great. Thank you, George, and welcome everybody. Just a disclaimer at the outset that the ASAA has been consistently working to advocate for our schools and to make sure that the environment that we're creating is conducive to competition, but only, of course, under the guidelines of Alberta Health Services and the government of Alberta. The Executive Committee just wants to remind everybody that when it comes to the decision-making process, it is Alberta Health Services and the government of Alberta that set the guidelines that we follow. We can have more restrictive guidelines, we can't have less restrictive guidelines, but of course, from there then, and we can put out, as we have, a variety of documents, but it's up to the superintendents then to make a decision within their own school district regarding how they will allow school athletics to continue. And then within each building, principals make their decisions as well. So we just wanted to make sure that people are aware that that's the hierarchy of the decision-making process. So we do not overrule principals, superintendents, or obviously AHS and Government of Alberta. Next slide, Mike. I won't go through this with you. You have the slide deck, and Mike has put the link to the most updated slide deck in the chat. So please go there and link to the most recent one if you wish. But it's just important, I believe, that there are. It's just important for people to understand the number of things that have been done. It has been a challenge, but your executive committee as volunteers have been absolutely outstanding through the summer, as have the staff, in trying to stay on top of all things COVID-related and school sport related as we try to sort of navigate this new normal. I'm not going to read the timeline to you. You can look at that later. And of course, that work continues today with a variety of groups that we are meeting with and advocating for our schools with. So where are we today? Our most recent publication was a September 9th document. We'll go through a couple of things on that. It does clarify some positions around cohorts, but Stephen and Marvin will address that later. And at this point, the ASAA isn't preventing students from taking part in multiple cohorts as long as they abide by the government of Alberta guidelines. And again, Stephen and Marvin will address that with you later on. And we're also going to talk briefly about membership fees, which is next up. Thanks, Mike. So just going to cover off the first two slides for now, or the first two bullets, I should say. So this time, the association is not discounting membership fees. There are a lot of unknowns ahead, and the executive very strongly feels that the association needs to be able to and ready to serve the members if and when we get back to the point of full participation in school sport. They need to be ready to pivot, and the executive feels strongly that we need to allow the association staff and executive to have the ability to do that by keeping the membership fees where they are. But at the same time, it's really important that we'll be looking for whatever savings there are. There'll be cost savings, and there'll be things that we won't spend money on, but there'll also be revenues that we won't get from certain things that we do on an annual basis. So we're certainly optimistic that by the time we get to the end of the year, there'll be a surplus, and the plan is that any surplus membership fees left over, or any surplus in our budget, rather, will go back to our member schools, whether it's by way of rebate or whether it's by way of a reduction of next year's membership fees. Thanks, Mike. Next slide. And I'll be quick on this one. As if you are currently a coach in a school or you're an AD, you would know that there are certain coach requirements expected in Alberta, and they're listed down there. You can see the bullets there. The brand new course is just a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks away from being completed and published on the Coaching Association of Canada site, our new partner. It's called Coaching School Sport, Redefining Winning. Normally, you would have to complete that by October 10, but in a few days, we'll be sending out a document confirming flexibility on all of the dates that we have for registrations, course completions, and those sorts of things. So at this point, the starting point for deadline is December 31 for that course. It may get further extended, just depends on circumstances. And every coach, one coach in every team has to have the bylaws and policies course, and every coach must complete Making Headway Concussions in Sport. That's a replacement to the old ASAA concussion course, but because there are no registrations that are due between now and Christmas, there's lots of time to get those things done. But we recommend that while coaches do have, or if they do have a bit of time, that they consider getting those courses done. So I talked about the flexibility, and but we certainly strongly recommend that if you are having your coaches and students involved in practices or mini leagues, scrimmages, according to the government guidelines, then you should have those coaches complete the bylaws and the concussion course, particularly the concussion course for safety purposes. Thanks, Mike.
Perfect. Thanks, John. I appreciate you taking time to go through them. Some hot topics there around fees and also around the coaches' certification stuff. No matter what, when we're working with athletes, the ASA wants to maintain that we want to have our people in front of student athletes at the highest level that they possibly can be at, and not make it burdensome. So, lots of flexibility on there. When it comes to the fees, our office is probably working 10 times harder than it ever has before. There's less revenue coming in also. So between that and the demands, we want to be able to function as a full office, and then where we can save money, we will, and make sure that goes back to our membership. We're not in a money-making business. It's providing services for the student athletes. Next up, we have Rick, who's just going to address some of the guidelines around competition.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Just a couple of bullets to ponder as reminders. We're not we don't have any desire to be overly prescriptive or offer particular examples at this time. I think our first key point is that at any time in or out of a COVID environment, it is the school jurisdictions who have the ability to control whether schools participate. The superintendent and principals have that final say in participation. And so we're seeing, even with the bulletins that have gone out, that jurisdictions still have the ability to say, we're not ready yet or we're ready yet. And we encourage all of our coaches to follow the counsel of their principals and superintendents in that regard. Mini leagues are allowed, provided all government of Alberta, school jurisdiction, school and local guidelines are followed. Those have to stay inside of that cohort piece that will be described in greater detail later. We would encourage you to work within your zones, your zone establishments, to see what other options are available for you in that regard as we look at fall sports and some of the activities that are taking place, to see what you might be able to do outside of your individual school group or small cohorts in your jurisdiction. All fall AS2A championships have been postponed until a point where we have guidelines that are conducive to running a championship event that can have adequate representation across the province. And that leads nicely into the last bullet here. We want to assure everyone in the call today, as we have tried to assure everyone across the province in all of our documentation, that the executive is committed to considering all options, striking a committee that will look at reallocating or reassigning fall sports, and with the opportunity to explore a provincial championship for all of our sports at some time in the year. There are a lot of variables involved in that. We're very aware of that as we've been working our way through this. It will require delicate balances and choices on behalf of students, athletes, and families and schools to determine who's in and who isn't for various sports as we strive to provide that opportunity for all our student athletes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. That was awesome. Yeah, it's a lot of choices are in the process of being made by a lot of different people. We want to respect all the different places they come from and support them. That's what our job is as an office for the AS2A. So if you need any directions or guidance or support as you're working through these things at a school or a zone level, feel free to reach out to us and we can support you. There's lots of documents which I recommend that you read every one of them, and that moves in perfectly to Marvin and Steve's part of the presentation. Up to you guys.
Great, thanks a lot, George. Thanks to the ASAA for the invitation to be here with all of you this afternoon as we share some information on the SPAR guidance, and we're here to try to assist with answering some of your questions. Good segue to what Rick and John were talking about, as we now will share some of that information on the guidance. So when the initial shock of the COVID-19 lockdown passed, our attention shifted to contemplating what sport and physical activity and recreation would look like in an era of public health restrictions. The development and implementation of return to sport plans, driven by a commitment to sport organizations' members and the practicality of long-term sustainability, is definitely a task that all of us have undertaken without parallel or precedents in the past. It's certainly been a challenging time for all of us to navigate through these times. We certainly try to remain optimistic and positive that sport, physical activity, and recreation can continue to return safely throughout Alberta, as long as we're all working together and following the necessary guidelines and safety measures. Over the summer, we've seen many sports like soccer, baseball, softball, and golf already come back and have some successes, while also dealing with challenges that we've assisted them dealing with. Now, as we transition into the fall, we're seeing many other sports back up and running, including football, curling, hockey, and basketball, to name a few. Our team at SPAR have been working with many of the provincial sport organizations to assist them with their return to play guidelines and protocols, delivering education sessions like what we're doing today to assist the sector as we continue to adjust with what our new normal is. When the government of Alberta announced the return to play back on June 12th, they released the first SPAR guidance document. This document, as well as all other guidance and support documents, are located on the Alberta's BizConnect portal. And on the slide previous to the one, Mike, if you just want to flip back for a sec. Yeah, so here we have a list of all of the various SPAR guidance documents, as well as other documents that we'll refer to throughout the presentation today. Next slide, please, Mike. So right now we're working on the September 4th edition of the SPAR guidance. With each edition that comes out, there's a few more modification and updates that appear that have allowed window to open a little more with what sport can do. The overarching principles on the SPAR guidance are that outdoor activities are certainly preferred over indoors. Physical distancing is more suitable than the formation of cohorts, and that the guidance has been established to mitigate or lessen overall risk. These are compromises that are in place between where we were back in March and April when the lockdown was in effect, to the early months of the pandemic, and to where we are now at this point in time. So certainly it's contingent upon your organizations and members to follow the guidance provided by Alberta Health in the activities your organization, member schools, and individual members undertake. This guidance, as all of you are fully aware, can and does change quickly as we've been progressing through various stages of the relaunch. And it's certainly incumbent upon your organization and schools to ensure that you are all aware of the requirements in place at any one given time. Back on July the 10th, we presented to some of you that are on the call today in regards to the initial release of our guidance of June 12th. Since that time, Stephen and myself, we've remained in ongoing contact with John and the executive on any relevant updates, attempting to assist the ASAA in how they navigate through their decision-making processes along the way. Recently, on September the 4th, Alberta Health and SPAR co-hosted a town hall on updates from the September 3rd version of the SPAR guides. Alberta Health is continuing to finalize the review of the questions that arose on that town hall, and certainly will be compiling responses that will be provided to those that attended. So we continue to remain patient with Alberta Health during this time, knowing that their resources and capacities are limited as they're dealing with everyone in the province on all aspects of relaunching business, including education and sport, to name a few. I'm now going to turn it over to Stephen. He'll provide you with an update on the latest version of the SPAR guidance, and then we'll run through some of the pre-submitted questions and themes that were sent in advance. So over to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Marvin. Thank you, George and John, for having me here today as well. Yeah, we'll just talk about a few things specific to the Alberta Health Services Sport, Physical Activity, and Recreation Guidance. So first, let's talk about cohorts. Certainly, it's applicable to most sports. And there are a number of different cohorts that exist. So there's your core or your family cohort, which is your bubble, and it's up to 15 people. These are the people that you are most closely with. There's physical contact on an ongoing basis. Today's presentation will deal mostly with a sport or performance cohort, maximum up to 50 people. Another word that we'll use interchangeably is a mini league. Performance relates to theater or dance. So they are lumped in the same type of cohort. Of course, the school cohort you guys would be familiar with, and then there's also child care, out of school care, and that cohort can be up to 30 people. Albertans might find themselves in more than one cohort at the same time. The expectation is that the total number of cohorts are limited. Interacting with the same people in the same cohorts are safer than constantly changing the people you interact with. And those with sports, performing, and or child care cohorts should consider having smaller core cohorts given the total number of close contacts between all groups. So specific, next slide please, Michael, and moving specifically to a sport cohort. Oh, I'm sorry, back one. Oh, all right, thank you very much. So sport cohorts and mini leagues. First off, the expectation is that individuals minimize or limit the number of sport cohorts that they participate in. And I'm just going to read you a quote from Dr. Dina Hinshaw from her August 27th press conference. "We have not officially restricted the number of cohorts that children can belong to. Having said that, it would be my recommendation for parents especially, as school is going back in person, to keep the number of cohorts that their children are a part of to as small a number as possible." Hey, Marvin, can you mute your line, please? So what is a cohort? What is a 50-person cohort? A 50-person cohort or a mini league can be formed for sports, physical activity, and recreation that involve physical interaction of participants at a distance of less than 2 meters. So as Marvin mentioned earlier, outdoor is better than indoor. So any activity that we can move outdoor, even if it's traditionally indoor, we want to do so. And physical distancing is better than cohorting. So even if we're cohorting, we want to be physically distancing as much as possible. So even in the model that I'm about to go into, if there's avenues for training that are physically distanced, if there's an opportunity to keep people where they are spread out throughout the gymnasium instead of culling them into a huddle, that is ideal as well. We want to keep people as far apart as possible. And then masks also come into play here. We want to mask up as much as possible, understanding that we probably shouldn't be masking up if we're doing intense physical activity. So what does that mean for the cohort? The 50-person maximum includes any coaches, staff, instructors, participants, officials, and volunteers who consistently and routinely engage with participants at a distance of less than 2 meters. Coaches, staff, and officials who primarily interact with individuals or teams at a distance of 2 meters or greater do not need to be counted as part of the cohort. These individuals are required to wear a mask and perform proper hand hygiene if it becomes necessary to temporarily interact with cohorting participants at a distance of less than 2 meters. So if we can stay outside of that 2 meters on an ongoing basis, we can stay outside of the cohort, and we can temporarily interact with them through masks and through sanitizing. If we are more than temporarily, we need to be inside that cohort. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so mini leagues then. Again, sport cohorts, mini leagues, they're interchangeable terms. A mini league would be comprised of multiple teams, but up to that same maximum of 50 individuals. Gameplay should be limited to teams within the same mini league, and other leagues should not interact. This could be teams within your same school. It could be teams within the same area. So you could have 4 volleyball teams that are from different schools that would fit within the 50 individuals. If an individual or team member wishes to change cohorts, they should not participate in a new cohort activity for 14 days, reflecting the incubation period of the virus. And if a mini league were to come to completion during stage 2, you could create a new mini league, provided there is that 14-day period. And an alternative or a hybrid of this is if there were 4 volleyball teams that were participating in a mini league, you could cease that mini league, but your volleyball team could continue practicing. And then after 14 days, you could join with 3 other teams and create a mini league. So what we're looking to do with that 14 days is separate the old contacts from the new contacts. Next slide, please. All right, travel and spectators. So the new guidance on September the 3rd, actually August 28th, and then September 3rd, has removed all restrictions for travel for sport and physical activity. So where 2 meters of physical distancing between individuals is maintained, or where the mini league model is employed, you may now travel for sport, physical activity, and recreation. Of course, travel is a school district decision as well, and so any policies will apply with regards to travel. With regards to spectators, for outdoor seated spectators, so think a track and field or a soccer stadium, we can have up to 200 maximum. And for indoor gymnasium type settings, 100 would be the maximum with a distance of 2 meters between attendees. However, you have to ensure that there is enough space for that 2 meters. So it would be capacity based on physical distancing. Certainly inside, it is strongly recommended that all spectators wear masks. I know a lot of the larger jurisdictions have this in place for municipal bylaws, etc. Next slide, please. So tournaments, races, and competitive events are now permitted for sport, physical activity, and recreational activities, again, where you can maintain that 2 meters or you follow the mini league model. If you can't keep that cohort model, then the event is not permitted. And any tournaments or events that compel a new cohort team to be formed for a short period are not permitted at this time. So if it's just, hey, we haven't played anybody from Calgary, we're gonna invite them up and have a tournament. If they're not already in your cohort, it isn't allowed. Next slide, please. Quickly go into rapid response. Certainly if any of your participants, your students become sick while participating, you're gonna wanna get them out of the facility as quickly as possible. You wanna isolate them, get them away from people, have them mask up. And then you want to ensure they have safe transportation home, although we hope that's not on buses, taxis, hopefully a parent or solo transportation. Obviously, if there's someone sick in your facility, you want to be looking at cleaning and disinfecting. There is no need to cancel or postpone the activity. And we certainly understand that your school and division will likely have more comprehensive procedures than what I've just outlined here in 20 seconds. So ensure you're aware of that. As well, if you are a sport that is participating in in a non-school facility, for example, curling, the facility would likely have a rapid response plan as well, and you should be familiar with it. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to pass this back to Marvin. You can walk us through some of the pre-submitted questions.
All right, so we had a few questions that were submitted in advance, and I think a few of these we've already addressed. Clarification between when a coach and/or official counts towards the cohort limit of 50. Again, the 50-person maximum includes coaches, staff, instructors, participants, officials who routinely engage with their participants at a distance of less than 2 meters. And I think, you know, a lot of times we've been getting the question about, you know, that 50 number and whether or not those individuals should count towards the cohort or not. I think to effectively coach, I think you have to include those individuals. However, if they can maintain that physical distancing and wearing masks, then that's fine as well. Stephen, do you want to take number 2?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marvin. So can student athletes participate in more than one sport cohort? And if yes, can one be with school and one with community? So as I indicated earlier, there are no government restrictions on the number of cohorts. It's certainly Dr. Hinshaw's desire and expectations that we're all doing our part to limit the number of interactions we have. And for any of the math teachers out there, you can give a demonstration of how exponentially our interactions grow if we belong to more than one cohort. So again, we should limit the number of cohorts we belong to. However, it isn't a school decision. It's likely a parental decision, family decision. And as a school and as a division, you're certainly welcome to make decisions that are more restrictive in relation to the number of cohorts. And you can implement additional protocols or practices in place. I'll just move on to number 3, an example of how a mini league could work. Again, what we're talking about here is we're talking about 50-person maximum leagues. It works obviously better for some sports, better than others. And if you're talking about a sport like golf or badminton, you know, that's outside of the cohort. Those are physically distant sports, so this doesn't necessarily apply. Urban versus rural, you know, for those schools that are in an urban setting and have other schools of the same size within their municipal boundaries, you know, you're likely not having to travel much in order to participate in any sort of mini leagues. Now, with all travel restrictions lifted, it's certainly possible for rural schools to travel down the road. And you know, again, we don't want to be going too far. We don't need teams in Lloydminster going all the way to Medicine Hat. But if you have a neighboring community that you want to partner with in order to form a mini league, that's certainly possible at this time. For question 4, the first one there, any anticipated expansion of 50 people? At this time, Alberta Health has given no indication that they will be increasing this amount, despite a number of provincial sport organizations, etc., requesting an increase. I think at this time, with regards to school going back, they certainly want to see where we're at in a few months' time and see how this is all panned out. The additional question along those same lines is when stage 3 might occur. And again, we're certainly no closer to stage 3 at this point. Health has given no indication of moving forward from stage 2 in our relaunch. Marvin, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So the last question that was pre-submitted was about how you can run, you know, a school program safely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few observations from what some of the other provincial sport organizations have adopted over the summertime and some of those points of emphasis. So obviously safety is the #1 priority. Compliance with public health guidelines is non-negotiable. You know, based on public health guidance, organizations have been developing a range of protocols, practices, and supports within their associations. They've worked with their national sport organizations, other provincial sport organizations. And in your cases, you certainly want to work with your school boards other schools within your areas, and respective provincial health authorities. The second component, I guess we'll talk about a little bit, is the quality experience. So obviously, before you get back up and running, you certainly want to take the time and the initiative to put together something that's going to show an obligation to the values that you certainly portray, as well as those of the ASAA and your respective schools. So certainly over the past number of months, we've seen a number of different examples and ways in which people have tried to run programs. We've seen everything from virtual programming to live streaming, to some of the large organizations which may have formed hubs or bubbles with the pro sports as examples. And then we've seen the development of consumer apps to support diverse program delivery. So I think, one of the things that we certainly spent some time on with the provincial sport organizations was in those early stages was to caution them in terms of taking their time. So look at, programs that focus on physical distancing, the emphasis on skill development opportunities, developing those relationships amongst teammates and coaches, rather than just jumping straight into what we know is normal competition. Ultimately, we certainly want to take a look at the resources and the tools of cohorting and mini leagues to lead us into meaningful competition when the time is right. Third point there to look at is stakeholder engagement and communication. So certainly we want to make sure that we're communicating with everyone who's involved with the establishment of your respective school program. We have to ensure that all parties are accurately informed and aware of the respective return to sport plans and guidelines. And certainly you have to make sure that your people are going to be flexible and adaptable regardless of what type of plan that you come up with for your respective schools and teams. Fourth item, supporting the broader sport community or school community. So through all of this, sport leaders have connected with external organizations and networks to share and learn from promising practices and evidence-based approaches. Given the challenges everyone is facing, it's certainly been refreshing to see the openness and transparency that everyone has been exhibiting through this time. So, now might be the time you might want to throw at some of that competitiveness and that sometimes exists between respective schools and share information so everybody can come back more effective. It's okay not to have the answers. Tap into your networks, ask questions, and access the expertise and insight that you need to get your programs back up and running. And then finally, I think you want to take an intentional approach. So I would say that this is probably the most important element. Be slow, take extreme caution, exhibit an intentional approach. Start small. You don't have to be a hero at the outset to get your program up and running just because you may be feeling the pressure from those around you. Use this as an opportunity to disrupt the status quo, recalibrate and reprioritize, and in some cases deliver your sports/teams differently than what has been done in the past. We want to see the creation of safe and equitable school communities that support student athletes and the broader school community as we all look to return to sport within schools across the province. So George, I'll throw it back to you now for the next part of the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Marvin, Steve. Yeah, safety is one collective effort of all of us, right? And as much as we want sport to look like it looked like in the past, currently it's not going to look that way. And I think being adaptive and being conscientious of the steps you make. The most important thing that happens right now is that students get to be around really strong adults that are going to be really good role models in them. So you might not have a trophy to host up at the end of the season, but the most important thing is that they're getting the experiences that they'll remember for the rest of their lives from that adult and them guiding those students through at this time. We have to remember that, the Alberta Health Services and the government of Alberta, is where we get a direction from. Right now, a lot of our problems come from, we have a school reentry, we got a division reentry, and we got a SPARS document. I hope here in the future, we'll be able to get some clarity around that. But I think eventually when it comes to that 330 on, the SPARS document is going to be that primary document that we have to focus on. And then as Stephen pointed out in his presentation, when it comes back to that health and safety, the extension work will be back at that division level, where there'll be some more precautions to take if we do have to get to a health way. But navigating those three documents can be hard. There's cohort, there's mini leagues, there's things like that. But when we talk about school sport after school, the SPARS document is the one that I strongly recommend. And I have a really strong feeling that some of our educational documents that will be coming out in the future here will also reference that document as the primary one to look at when it comes to sport. We're going to move on to the Q&A component right now. We will stop at 4:25 precisely, but as said before, if your question isn't answered currently right now, then we are keeping a full record of the questions and we'll produce a document with all the answers to those. We want to make sure that we look at all the stakeholders and we answer the question at 100%, not just from an ASAA perspective or just from a SPARS perspective, but from a collective perspective. So Mike, first question. If we are permitted by our zone district to run teams with practice, coaches will not need these coach-ed courses prior to starting the deadline. So all the coaches to start next, we wouldn't need the course to coach. Hypothetically, you wouldn't, but we strongly recommend that these courses are very vital, you know, in your practices of being a good educated coach along the way is going to make your practices even better, especially around health safety, but also around the mental aspects of sport. John, am I missing anything on that?
No, George.
So yeah,
not mandatory, but we're not policing it either.
Yeah, you can avoid it, you know, which is fine, but it's there for a purpose. It's to make everyone better. Mike, how are football teams in the South that are indicating they are competing in a jamboree format meeting the government of Alberta? Well, I assume, and I can only assume, that they've probably taken their team 14 days before their jamboree and they've split that team into 14 days and practice separately. And then when they go to the jamboree, they function as a defensive unit or an offensive unit, and they're playing against that other team. So when they put the two together, it's 50 and 50, but they have to make sure they have that 14 days in between before they go to that. So they can't practice as a full roster and then on Friday go to a jamboree. 14 days prior to that, they'd have to separate into two groups. Their coaches would have to make sure they're social distancing at all times, and then they could go to a jamboree and join with another 25 athletes from another school. Or they maybe only have 24 on each team, and then they're coming together for a jamboree. Steve, missing anything there? Marvin?
Not being familiar with the rules that jamboree is running under, it would be tough for me to say.
But they have to still follow the government of Alberta. They can't be bigger than 50, and they have to have 14 days in between if they are splitting their team up. So,
correct.
Yes, Marvin?
George, I was just going to mention quickly, it'd be interesting if the football commissioner for the ASAA could maybe do a check on that and get back to us, because I would certainly be interested to see how they actually formed that and what they did.
Yeah, we're already on top of that one too, because we're very interested ourselves. So, next question. For multiple cohorts, can a student play on a school team cohort and be on a community cohort in the same sport, school and club volleyball? Well, currently, according to our policies and bylaws, unfortunately, they can't. If they're on two-team rule, we are looking to make adjustments to that so we can support the student athletes. They can be on two different cohorts, one at school, one away from school. The two-team policy right now is getting in the way of that, and we're in review of that right now for the COVID year only. John, am I missing anything on that?
I have, just for people's information, I've prepared a memo from the executive and have been receiving feedback on that memo today. So something should be coming out in the next 2 days to provide greater clarity around this one.
Okay, next question. Is there an indication of which school districts are currently organized for John, do you have the details on that? I know that we've done the survey work on it.
We have, we've been collecting some information from the various school districts on what is happening for them in relation to sports. And we've just been asked at this point, you know, if somebody calls and they have a question, we can share that information with them. But the last thing that we want to do is to be pitting one school district against another by opening the door for people to say, oh, this district's doing this and you're doing that. Why aren't you doing as much as they are? And we don't want to put that type of pressure onto superintendents at this time during COVID, because there are so many variables that need to be considered. It's not just a simple matter of who's practicing and who's not, but we know in most cases who is. So if you have a particular question, please contact me in the office tomorrow, and I'll be able to answer that question for you. But the range is very broad in terms of what's happening across the province. Edmonton Public and Metro started today. Calgary might start in a week's time. Some rural areas started on the 1st of September, and there are others that are on indefinite postponement. So it's all over the place.
Next question. Tournaments are not permitted. I'll pass this one on to you, Stephen. So I think what they're saying is they could have a mini cohort come together on a weekend, play 2-3 games, regroup over 14, and they want to call it a tournament versus a mini cohort. Any direction on this one?
Yeah, so as I indicated, I mean, ideally the cohorts are in place for a longer term. We want to limit our interactions. So a 3-team mini cohort, a 3-team tournament, if it's the same thing, you know, if you're just using a tournament format, that's fine. If you take the 2 weeks off, yeah, then you would be within guidance. That 14 days break between cohorting, between contacts would be within guidance.
Yeah, I think, you know, like if you could do that over 2 weekends and, you know, run 2 games one weekend and then run 2 games next week and then regroup, then that group is, from a health standpoint, is in a better place, I guess, is what we're trying to influence you towards, right, Marvin and Steve? Okay. Thank you. Next question. If there are any updates on whether Hockey Alberta will, I'll pass it on right to Marvin right off the bat.
Yeah, so the question's a really good one, and certainly I've been working closely with Hockey Alberta, and Hockey Alberta is essentially using the same language in their return to sport guidelines in terms of limiting the number of cohorts that you're in. So what I would suggest to this individual who's at a rural school is that you probably may want to try to reach out to your local minor hockey association in your respective community and just have that discussion with them. Because if they're doing something differently and if they're communicating different messages, then we certainly have some issues that need to be addressed by Hockey Alberta. So hopefully that'll help you out and we can get this one cleared up for sure.
Yeah, each association has the ability to make stricter rules, but I think in general across the province, people are understanding that we're supporting the limiting versus number restriction right now to allow people to make choices from a social standpoint. Next question. Has there been a discussion around moving seasons around, for instance, starting with badminton, moving volleyball? I'll pass this on to Rick. I know he's dying to answer this one.
I don't know that dying to answer is the correct answer, but I did see some other questions posted after we had spoke on this question. We have a full year layout with all of the holidays, the November, April, January, June exam schedules, and we're looking at every opportunity to adjust, shorten some seasons, and try to avoid having more than 2 provincial championships on the same weekend, but still managing to have seasons for all sports that AS2A offers that culminate with the provincial championship. But those first provincial championships would not be until sometime, the first one's possibly as early as February. But this is why we're striking a committee to look at the various options that are there. What we would need to do to not have people coaching from September to February in a sport like, say, volleyball, and how we might get some basketball in at this point and then come back with provincials. That all of those variables are on the table as we try to honor all the sports and provide students with the greatest exposure possible.
And to add to that, just to make, and of course, the whole time staying in line with the guidelines provided by Alberta Health Services and Government of Alberta. So if we're not at stage 3 or the cohort sizes aren't bigger or the opportunity to have that competition doesn't come into play with government requirements, then we'll have to question whether or not the certain events can go ahead. Just it's still so many unknowns at the second week of school.
Yeah, very important point by John. It goes back to kind of what Marvin touched upon. It's about giving some students some opportunities right now in a safe way. And like I said, being around those adults that have such a strong influence on them, especially during such a trying time. So, good question, and thank you. Next one, Mike. Still some confusion with cohorts. If your division decides against mini leagues and we are just going to school training and practice, is it fine for kids to be part of their club volleyball and cohort and school cohort? As John touched upon, if it's in the same sport, we're in the process of making those adjustments for this exact reason. So in other words, if your school team is not competing in any kind of mini leagues, but they're finding that opportunity through their club, we're looking to make adjustments to that, but it still has to go through a zone level of approval. There's lots of steps in place before we can solidify that actually being what it's gonna happen. But right now, if they choose to be on two teams, for two different sports, they can belong to a school cohort and then a different one for sure. And more to come on that. John, am I missing anything?
No, more is coming.
Well, right now, that's part of the reason a lot of the stuff we're doing is we don't want to be the police. And I don't think we should have to be the police. Hopefully one is collectively taking responsibility for the situation we're in, and wouldn't put, as all of us have said, put competition in front of safety. It's a game. It's very important in the development of youth, but at the same time, it's not the end all at all. That's just my personal comments on this. Steve and Marvin, I know there are fines and things like that, but I know that's not where the government really wants to go with this.
Yeah, so I mean, this question is really two parts. We're talking about violation of cohorts, and we're talking about violation of mandatory isolation periods. The number of cohorts, again, there's nothing that restricts anyone, so there isn't really an issue there. With regards to the mandatory isolation periods, there definitely are legal ramifications and fines that can be put in place if people are supposed to be quarantined and are not. Who's monitoring that? Certainly, ideally, hopefully the parents. We know that's not always the case. Your school should be aware of any, internal COVID cases and who has been identified as either being positive or needing to isolate because of risk to others. So certainly that, that should be done at a school administration level. Maybe I'm wrong with that, George. And I think that, ultimately if someone's testing positive, there's certainly are ramifications if they're out and about in public.
Well, I think that's where it gets a little tricky on the cohort when you have that sport cohort after school. If something happens in class, when Alberta Health Service arrives to do that investigation, they're going to be looking for every point of contact that possibly that student could be in. So for a high school student who has physics in the morning and social in the afternoon and then goes to their sport cohort, all three will be evaluated by Alberta Health Services if there is a case, right? So, and schools will be involved in that. So. And Alberta Health Service will give us the direction on who can and who can't. And they're very good and thorough at it. So, next question. Have you considered that pushing back championship dates will just impact small 1A schools which have large cross sections of multi-sport athletes? Rick, John?
That is definitely a concern that we talk about frequently. In the end, if the green light comes from Alberta Health, as John mentioned in the last question, we'll put the opportunity out and people will have to make choices. And really that's all we're going to be able to do. We're going to try to stagger as much as we can sports that commonly overlap so that they can make those choices and maximize their exposure. John?
And this is why we're striking a committee, and a committee that has a global view, particularly as we do look at multi-sport athletes and how we do espouse the benefits of multi-sport athletes. So there are a lot of factors to consider, everything from school size to gym availability to officials to coaches. Coaches often coach two sports. The list of things is very long. So the committee will have a real challenge ahead of them, but they'll do the best they can to try and come up with a contingency plan that may end up working, it may end up being implemented, or it may end up being for naught if there are not the required relaxations of government policy for full-out provincials to occur.
Next question, Mike. Wrestling. Can we still practice and have cohorts? I know wrestling has lots of contact. So, well, first step is we need to be working in conjunction with the provincial sport order for wrestling. I think would be the first step, right, John? Anything else?
Wrestling is, I mean, maybe Stephen or Marvin could jump in, but it does have a lot of contact. But if a school has a cohort group of up to 50 people that are training together and they're staying within that cohort, then the the cohort restrictions, the sport and recreation guidelines document allows for students or youth who are closer than 2 meters to be able to have those competitions as long as they stay within the same cohort. So the challenge, of course, would come is if those wrestlers want to compete against wrestlers from another school, and if that's the case, then there'd have to be the 14-day waiting period and then still working with the cohort of 50. I'm not sure if Stephen, you want to jump in or Marvin?
Yeah, for sure. I want to say, first of all, that the guidance that we saw right from the very beginning from Alberta Health in May with our stage 1 and even stage 0 has always been inclusivity and trying not to eliminate certain activities over others. So wrestling certainly is allowed to participate in sport. Right, it's a sport that's acceptable and approved. We want to what we want to do is for each sport, we want to take a look at what is about that sport specifically and make any modifications we can if possible. So John was right on. Certainly you can cohort with regards to wrestling. What you may want to do is only cohort your similar weight classes. You may only have 2 or 3 kids in each school, in each wrestling program that are within 2 meters. The issues obviously come around cleaning the mat, sanitizing the mat with our faces being right on the mats. Obviously we have to clean those very often, but that's certainly something you could look at. But yes, the answer to your question is you can definitely continue with contact. Marvin?
George, or Stephen, just quickly, what I would consider here is I would have the individual who posed the question to contact Alberta Wrestling and talk to Andrew and the people in their office specifically about their return to sport protocols. I think this is one of the ones where we certainly need to lean on the leadership and expertise of those who are working with this respective sport to ensure that we're doing the proper things here at this point in time and moving forward.
Perfect. Mike, next question. John?
Thank you, Mike. Sorry, you don't have to because we're not having a championship season right now anyway. The registration deadlines are basically not being applied, no penalties or anything like that. But we certainly recommend that if you have chosen a team and you're involved in mini leagues or just even practicing, in the event that we do end up reinstating a season after Christmas, for those sports that are postponed right now, it's probably easier for you to have the athletes in the system than not. The other thing that helps us with, it's not critical because of COVID, but it does help us as an organization when we report to the government on the number of kids that are involved in our activities. So unless you put them in the system, we won't know how many kids we have. But at the same time, we recognize that we can't make it mandatory if there is no championship they're going to. So we recommend it, can't force it.
Doesn't it help us a bit too, John, to just have some indication from schools that if we could participate, if we have the ability to go, we're interested in going, and registering gives us that information?
For sure, because at some point, decisions will need to be made on whether or not provincial is going to occur, and if there's a minimum standard of number of zones involved to be able to hold a provincials, what is that? And that will be probably up to the committee. But the more we know are out there, the better chance we have of running something if they're registered.
I would say it would help the committee a great deal to know 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, all the way up, who would be interested in competing if we can compete. That would help with our planning. Yeah. So from that point of view, I would encourage you registering.
Okay, next question, Mike. Infringing and bringing next sport season or should start or winter sports potentially be pushed back as well?
I think we've answered this one.
I think we've answered it. That's why the committee is being formed, is trying to work through these things. So, Mike? Unable to play sports this year. Rick, you got a great answer for this one.
Well, the simple fact, folks, we went through this in the spring with the athletes who lost the opportunity to compete in their provincials in the spring and had can kids come back next year and play? Can we relax our grade 12 rule? The simple fact is this: any this impacts everybody. If we bring students back so they could have their grade 12 season, then the grade 11s of this year are impacted and lose that opportunity to compete. No matter what, this will trickle down and negatively impact all the way down. This is our year. Last year was last year. This is this year. We're all sharing in the experience negatively and positively. And we can't see a way of giving another year of eligibility without compounding the penalty down below each grade.
Perfect, thank you. And Mike, one last one. Well, it all depends. If he is social distancing, then there's no problem. But I think that when it comes to belonging to cohorts, you have to limit them and you have to make those choices yourself. So if he's coaching volleyball and that's one cohort, and then he's playing men's hockey, that's another cohort. He needs to limit those and follow all Government of Alberta guidelines on this. Is that right, Steve and Marvin?
Yeah, 100%. You know, I mean, ideally we want to limit them. Physical distance whenever possible on that volleyball team. Your schools and districts may have policies in place as well, but there's no restriction against this.
Before we move to kind of closing here, there's two questions I did see that came up that I'll answer real quick. One's around volunteer coaches from outside the school. That is at school level in your jurisdiction, whether they're allowed to be in place right now. That is not something through the Government of Alberta. For example, I know that Edmonton Public currently here, we are not allowing outside school coaches into our schools, whether it's inside or outside. I know that's so, well, they can coach outside the school, so out in the field. No, just no volunteers in the building other than just teachers. The other one was around, sorry, I just forgot it. What was it around? Oh, sorry. So right now people are waiting on us to produce something from the office on the two teams sport. I do not believe if someone is right now starting school volleyball and playing club volleyball right now, if they both can find facilities for that to happen, then I think right now currently we're not going to penalize anyone until that document comes out. But what we need to let people know is that there could be adjustments made. So don't make too big of plans until we're sort of fully ready for this. I wish we were more prepared for it, but it's sort of as things have rolled out in front of us. Parents concerned about how much money they've invested in the club, but then they know their kids want to play on school teams and wear their school colors. We're trying to get a balance of both those things. I would recommend that, yes, they can start, but don't get too deep dug into it until we have a formal document in front of you on what that will be. So first of all, I'd like to really thank Stephen and Marvin. They do lots of these. I don't know how they do it. I've done two and I'm exhausted from them and probably don't want to participate in one ever again. I don't mean that. I enjoy this a lot actually, because the important thing is that we're getting to a place of as much clarity as possible. But let's remember, there isn't black and white on a lot of this stuff and it's constantly evolving, or as my district likes to use, we're always having to pivot. So be patient. The most important thing is that you're being good leaders, that you're remembering that competition isn't our number one focus today. It's about getting people back together and using sport to create those memories and skills that are going to affect someone for the rest of their lives. That's the most important thing that we're doing here. Today's session was recorded. It'll be up on the ASAA webpage. You can also watch the previous one where there were some different questions addressed. The staff are working hard on the FAQ document and will address every question and make sure that every member has a chance to see all the answers to those questions once we've done both town halls. A summary of the registration deadline and coaching education deadlines will be provided right away here around the corner. And just a reminder that there is a committee, and I'll take some ownership on that. That committee is a little slow in forming, just because we were just trying to work through so much stuff. We probably should have got a little more of a head start on this. But with so much unknown, I didn't want to have people do a bunch of planning and then have another change in documentation sent out by the Government of Alberta that has to pivot them in a totally different direction. So we've been a little slow to go on that, but I think that we're going to have a really global-minded group and we'll be able to do really good things. Lastly, to the office staff at the AS2A, we appreciate all the hard work you do answering questions all the time and being available. But let's remember, as members, they're there for us to serve us and support us. So don't stop asking, don't stop checking. It's better that we come to a place of clarity as best we can collectively. Don't rely on yourself. Don't work in isolation. I talk to Rick all the time on trying to get things clarified. He's eating dinner at 6:30 when I'm driving home from work, and I call them. So how do you interpret this? What do you see it as? We got to continue to work together because we don't want someone to make a mistake, because it is about health and safety. So thank you to everyone for your participation. Thanks to the panelists, and everyone have a good, safe night. Thank you.